All right, great. Welcome again, everyone, to the workshop tonight. We will be covering tax time for nonprofits, annual filings in this tax season. Welcome to this workshop from Community Law Center. I'm sorry we can't gather in person, but we are hopefully getting closer to that day when we can do it again. Community Law Center is a legal services provider to nonprofit organizations, and we can help with a variety of legal issues, including the tax issues we're going to cover tonight and other legal issues as well. What we're going to cover tonight, what you need to know for nonprofit filings. We'll talk about the information that you'll want to collect to complete the tax forms, as well as some changes due to COVID. Still some fewer than last year, but still some changes due to COVID. The actual filings themselves that you'll want to be aware of. So the Maryland Form 1 annual report and some other forms that you may want to be aware of as well. The IRS Form 990, and the version of that most of the organizations we work with will complete is the 990N e-postcard, which is what the small grassroots organizations that have gross receipts under $50,000 in a normal year are going to fill out that version of the form. Then there's also the charitable solicitation registration. We'll talk about some other important things to keep in mind for your organization and further legal assistance. The workshop tonight is just for informational purposes, and you shouldn't take it as legal advice because you really want legal advice to be tailored to your organization and its specific questions and needs. Attending the workshop doesn't make the organization a client of Community Law Center, but I will talk at the end about how your organization can get legal services. Okay, so some organizational information that you'll want to collect before you sit down to do the tax filings. You'll want to collect the current list of your board of directors and officers, so their names and their contact information, including phone numbers, mailing addresses, and email addresses. The dates of the start and end of your fiscal year. Usually this is in an organization's bylaws, so that's the first place to look. If it's not there, you might want to look at previous tax filings you've done, and it's something that you may want to add to your bylaws. Your Maryland Department ID number. So this is a number that you get when you register, when you incorporate with the state as a nonprofit. So it's something you can look up on their website, and I will point out where you can find that information. Your federal EIN, employer identification number. This is the number that you get from the IRS that you use when you apply for 501c3 status, when you open the bank account. Often you use it with grant makers, so it's something you will have gotten from the IRS. And I saw someone just joined. Welcome. We're just getting started. And I will say all of the slides will be sent to you along with some other sample documents and materials after the workshop. So don't feel like you need to write everything down. You will get a copy. Other documents and organization to compile. It's good to have a copy of your articles of incorporation and any articles of amendments, or at least know where to get them, know where you keep copies of those documents, a copy of your bylaws, your IRS determination letter if the organization is a 501c3 or 501c4 or other tax exempt organization. The name of the organization's bank and its account number, and then the amount of total revenue for the prior fiscal year. So everything that the organization brought in donations, grants, loans, contracts, if there was fee for service, any revenue that the organization brought in, make sure that you have that information available because that will be something that you'll need to complete on the forms. The amount of contributions you received in the prior fiscal year, so that you know what you're eligible for. This is going to be important for charitable registration, to know the general amount of more contributions above or below a certain number that I'll talk about. And then amount of contributions received so far in the current fiscal year. Okay, so the important forms that we're going to talk about for nonprofits in Maryland, there's the Maryland Form 1. which is one form that has two parts, the annual report and the business personal property return. The annual report is a two-page part of the form that every nonprofit and for-profit business in the state must fill out every year. Every nonprofit, even if you didn't do anything this year, even if it's brand new, just incorporated, you still want to fill this out to keep your nonprofit status in good standing. Some organizations may need to fill out the business personal property return as well, and I'll cover that when we get to that form. Then there's the IRS Form 990, and we're going to talk about the e-postcard, that version of this IRS form. We'll also talk about charitable solicitation registration, and there is different versions of this form depending on the amount of contributions that the organization received in the year. So there's a more involved form for organizations that bring in more than $25,000 in donations for the year, and then the exempt organization fundraising notice that is for organizations that bring in less than $25,000 in donations for the year. Those organizations don't have to pay a filing fee for this notice, but every organization that's asking for donations in Maryland or applying for grants in Maryland must do this every year and keep it updated. All right, so those are what we're going to cover, and now we're going to do a deeper dive into each one. First, some changes due to COVID. So some of the filing deadlines have changed. One that hasn't is the Maryland Form 1. So this is the annual report. It's still due April 15th. There's no extension currently, but every organization can apply for an extension as long as you do it by April 15th. So you have until April 15th to ask for a 2-month extension. It would then be due June 15th. Some extensions that are still in effect, State Department of Assessments and Taxation, SDAT, if there are any expiration or renewal deadlines that fall during the pandemic, you have until the 30th day after the date when the state of emergency is terminated to complete those forms, those applications. So you still have some time. We're still under the state of emergency. The Maryland state income tax filing, so for individual tax returns and for business entities and nonprofits, they have extended this from April 15th to July 15th. So this is different than the Form 1 that we're going to talk about. This is if your organization has income that is unrelated business income, so non-charitable income. For example, if the organization runs a business that's unrelated to its charitable work, it may have to pay taxes on those business proceeds. So that would be something where an organization might have to pay state income taxes, but it really depends on the circumstances. So that's definitely something that I'm happy to talk more with any group about if they have questions. Charitable solicitation registration. So I'm going to talk more about this, but again, this deadline has been extended until after the state of emergency is lifted. So the state isn't enforcing this deadline right now, but you do want to be aware that if you have grant makers or other funders who want to see that you've completed this registration, you may want to do it anyway because those funders are going to ask, did you complete this registration for the year? I believe, and I've seen on their website, although I haven't tried to go in person, that the state charter and personal property counter at State Center in Baltimore is still closed to the public. You can mail things in, you can use the Business Express website to do things online, but it looks like the office itself is closed until further notice. And then the expiration date for licenses, permits, registrations, authorizations issued by the state, including things like driver's licenses, vehicle registrations, and professional licenses. If those expire anytime, anytime soon, that's been extended until June 30th. So you still have more time to get those in, and we'll see what happens when we get to June 30th. Some other changes due to COVID, federal filing deadlines. You may have seen that the federal income tax filing deadline has been extended. So tax day for individual taxes and business taxes has been extended from April 15th to May 17th. So you've got an extra month to do your taxes there. But for nonprofits doing their annual filing as 501c3s, there hasn't been a deadline extension announced. You can request an extension, a 6-month extension of your time to file by completing this form 8868. And as for the 990N, there's the deadline, there isn't really a deadline. It depends on the organization, just completing that at least once every 3 years. So as I'll talk about, the organization, a 501c3 can be automatically revoked and lose its status if it doesn't do this filing at least once in every 3-year period. You really want to do it every year, but they'll automatically revoke the organization's 501c3 status if you don't do it at least once every 3 years. So there's no late penalty for filing it late, but you do want to make sure that you're doing it every year based on the organization's fiscal year. So we'll talk about that filing and why it's important to complete it and when it's due for every organization. Okay, so any questions so far before we jump into the forms themselves? Okay, great. We can always come back to questions if you have them. Okay, so the first form is the Maryland Form 1. This is the annual report and business personal property tax return. So what this is the annual state tax return that every corporation has to complete with the state. And that includes incorporated nonprofit organizations, it includes for-profit businesses, and they all have to turn this into the State Department of Assessments and Taxation, SDAT. The Form 1 is made up of 2 forms, the annual report, which every organization and for-profit business has to fill out every year, and then the business personal property return, which is required for some organizations if they own or lease personal property. And personal property is anything that is other than real estate. So things that are personal property include office supplies and furniture, equipment, tools, supplies, and anything else that's not real estate, land or buildings. So everyone has to fill this out. It's due every year by April 15th, and it covers the previous calendar year. So when you fill it out for this year by April 15th, you're going to be filling it out for 2020. And again, this deadline has not been moved. So this one is due April 15th. You want to fill this out every year to avoid losing the organization's incorporated status. So if you don't fill this form out every year, even if you don't own any personal property, even if the organization didn't do anything that year, you have to fill this out because the state wants to see this to know, okay, this organization is still, it still exists. We shouldn't forfeit it. It's still around. If you don't fill it out by April 15th, at first the state will list the organization on its website as not in good standing. And so that gives you notice, okay, we have to fill this form out so we don't lose the corporation. If you still don't file it, then the state will forfeit the corporation, ending its legal existence. And that means that your individual directors and officers, your board members, may be liable for the organization's actions where they weren't before because there was this legal entity that existed. So make sure you fill this out every year. If the organization is forfeited, you would need to file articles of revival with the state and pay a filing fee to get that nonprofit status back. So you can avoid that situation by filing the Maryland Form 1 every year. And you can check the organization's status. So this is where you want to go just to see, are we in good standing? Did we fill it out for this year or last year? You can go to that Maryland Business Express website, enter the organization's name, and then click View Business Details and General Information, Personal Property. You can see various information about the organization, including if you filed, I think it's within the last decade or so, you'll be able to see a copy of the organization's articles of incorporation and any amended documents that it's filed with the state. You'll be able to click on those and download a copy. Okay, how to file. So again, the Maryland Form 1 annual report, every nonprofit and for-profit has to fill it out. The for-profits have to pay a filing fee when they complete this form, but nonprofits don't. There's no filing fee for nonprofits or non-stock corporations, as they're legally called in Maryland. Although nonprofits may be subject to personal property taxes. In general, oh, I see a few people are joining us. In general, nonprofits, in general, we've not seen organizations be subject to personal propses. Typically, there may be situations where they are, but it's possible. So that is something to keep in mind. You'll fill this out, and then the state will review it, determine if there is any personal property tax owed. So to file it, you can either mail the forms into the state, and there's information on where to mail them in the instructions, or you can file online at the state Business Express website. You can also request an extension through the state website. So the forms are available online, and I'll make sure when I send this out to include links that you can click on to access these forms, as well as copies of them. And I can pull up, I'll stop the share briefly so we can take a look at some of the forms. Okay, so this is the annual report form. And you can see over on the top left, you'll see domestic non-stock corporation. That's what you'll click for your organization over here. And I'll also be sending a document with a guide for filling this out. You'll include information on the name of the organization, its mailing address, some of the other information that I mentioned at the beginning about the organization, about its directors. And then one thing I wanted to point out here, so on page 2, this is a 2-page form. So the second page, the form asks, does the business own, lease, or use personal property located in Maryland? So for most organizations, the answer is going to be yes. The organization probably owns something, maybe it's books or supplies or equipment, materials. So if that's the case, choose yes. If it doesn't own anything, choose no. That one is pretty straightforward. Where you get into questions is if you answered yes, but your entity is exempt or has been granted an exemption from business personal property tax assessment by the department, do not complete the personal property tax return. For religious groups, charitable, or educational organizations, the Form SD1 is optional. So we've been back and forth with the state a little bit over the past few years trying to clarify this. And what I think it really comes down to is organizations should say yes if they own any personal property. But the state has said that unless you're a religious organization or a couple of other types that I'll mention, you need to apply for an exemption from personal property tax, separate from your 501c3 exemption, separate from other exemptions. So, so what that means for most of the organizations we work with is that it can get a little complicated. If they own personal property and there's no exemption, they may need to fill out the business personal property return. So that's something to keep in mind, and I will return to that. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So as I said, here's the form. I'll be sending a copy of this and a link to it. So If you want to complete it online, which is probably the easiest way, you can go ahead and do that with the link to where you can find the department ID number. Another question it asks on the form, does the organization have a trader's license, which might also be called a business license? That would be something issued by the circuit court for the county or counties in which the organization is located. So if you answer yes to either of those questions, that's when you may need to fill out the business personal property tax return. And I will talk about that form next. Then just to complete the form, you'll have a corporate officer or a firm like a tax preparer complete the signature, and then you'll submit it to the state. So personal property tax exemption. So being incorporated as a nonprofit in Maryland and being a 501c3 tax exempt organization recognized by the IRS doesn't necessarily make the organization automatically exempt from personal property taxes. The exemptions that do exist that you can be aware of are if your organization is a religious group like a church or other place of worship, if it's a nonprofit hospital or a cemetery or mausoleum company, it's automatically exempt from personal property tax. Also, it's exempt if the organization owns all of the organization's personal property that it owns had a total original cost of less than $2,500. So if everything that the organization has originally cost less than $2,500, you're also exempt from personal property tax. And then the third exemption, if the organization has applied for and gotten an exemption from the state. So if it filled out this application that I'll talk about, then it and gotten that exemption, then it's not on the hook for any personal property taxes, and it doesn't have to fill out the additional business personal property form. So if your organization has one of those exemptions, we recommend, if you're doing the hard copy of the form, write on the form, the organization is exempt from the personal property taxes under this section of the Maryland Code, so that the state knows when they go to process it, okay, they're exempt, they have this exemption. So those are somewhat narrow exemptions. They don't cover all of, or even most, I would say, of the organizations that we work with. So if your organization doesn't fall in any of those categories, but you do own personal property, you may need to complete the business personal property return. The business personal property return is really, it's more involved than the annual report. It's going to ask about what the organization owns, the value of that property, depreciation over the years of that property. So I'll pull this form up so we can take a look. But one thing to be aware of, if your organization leases personal property like a copier or something like that, you should consult with the company that you lease the property from to make sure one of the two, either that company or your organization, is completing the business personal property return. Okay, so taking a look at the business personal property return. So this is the business personal property return. You can see it asks for some of the same information as the annual report at the beginning. And then you start to get into the location of where the property is, the original cost by year of acquisition for furniture, fixtures, tools, machinery, and equipment. And so it's asking for some more involved information. Commercial inventory, if the organization has commercial inventory. And there's also, I'll say, a pretty in-depth instructions from the state on filling this form out. So, if it looks overwhelming, at least, take a look, and then feel free to reach out to Community Law Center, take a look at the instructions, and I'm happy to talk more. So And some of this information isn't going to apply to your organization. This is the form for everybody, for-profit and nonprofit. So some things will apply to for-profit businesses that won't necessarily apply to nonprofits. So it asks for information about property owned by the business, used by others, and then the same, completing the preparer's signature. And let me return to the PowerPoint. So that's the business personal property return. And as you can see, it's 4 pages. And then just one other form. This is the SD1. It's a supplemental form that is really only necessary to fill out if the organization disposed of, sold, transferred, got rid of all of its personal property before January 1st of this year. So that's really when you must fill this form out, we've been told, but otherwise just something to be aware of. This is a supplemental form. So it's, unfortunately, there's what we had always been told in previous years, which is that charitable organizations are exempt from personal property taxes. Now it seems that the state is really saying you need to apply for this exemption unless you're a religious organization, a hospital, a cemetery or mausoleum company, or you own less than $2,500 of property original value. For other organizations, it seems that the state really wants them to fill out this application for exemption. So I will talk about that in a moment, how to do that exemption application. But what we're really recommending is that organizations take a look at the instructions, take a look at the forms, and talk with your board, your treasurer, others who know about the personal property that the organization owns. Supplies, equipment, materials, books, computers, all of that, and try to do an inventory, get a sense of what do we own, what information do we have about when we acquired it, and what its value is. You can request an extension for filling out the Form 1, the annual report, and if you need to fill the business personal property return out, so you can request that 60-day extension, but you do want to request the extension by April 15th. You can file amended returns within 3 years. If you missed any previous year's filings, you can fill them out. There's forms that you can get from the state website. And you want to make sure you do fill out those forms for previous years so that you have filings on record with the state for every year that the organization has been in existence. And then you can sign up for the state email list for reminders about filings, just so that it's on your radar come next April as well. Okay, so exemption from personal property taxes. So organizations can apply for exemption, which if granted would mean that the organization is exempt from if this tax is ever assessed on them, they wouldn't have to pay personal property tax. And it would mean that they don't have to fill out the business personal property return. And you can find that exemption online, and I'll also send a copy of it. So we've had some groups fill this out, and it seems that it can take some time to get a response from the state, but it can be worth it. If you think you may be subject to personal property tax, or if you say we own more than $2,500 worth of personal property, and we want to make sure that we're exempt and we don't have to complete that business personal property return every year. You can also contact the state for questions. There's a personal property valuation unit that just deals with the personal property questions. And here's what that exemption form looks like. So it asks about things like what the organization does, its sources of income, if it has employees, their salary structure, and some other questions as well. So before we move on to the other forms, are there any questions about what we've covered so far? Yeah, Eric, go ahead and you can put it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
For tax exemption, how do we go out? How do we go about filing for that? Because I know since well, our nonprofit now, we're doing more for fathers, and we trying to get like notebooks and other things for them, and we don't have the income yet, the influx of income to buy it, so we're spending it. We were paying for it. Where do we apply for that?
So for applying for the 501c3 status, that's with the IRS. So you've got the state. This is what we've covered so far is with the state of Maryland. So that's the incorporation to create the nonprofit. Once you've done that, then you go to the IRS to apply for 501c3 status. And that is the application is called the Form 1023 or 1023-EZ. And oh, sorry.
Yeah, we have that. We were incorporated in August of last year.
Okay.
But the not to pay taxes when we purchased like the books and everything, notebooks for the fathers for the in the program. I thought there was a tax exempt filing or tax exempt card that you can.
Oh yes. So that's I don't know if I have a little slide on it, but I will definitely make sure to send some information about that. But so sales tax exemption.
Yes, sales.
So yeah, that is once you have 501c3 status from the IRS, then it's yet another application. That one's to the state. So you can apply to the state and say, the IRS has recognized us as a 501c3, and now we want to apply to you for exemption from state sales and use tax. So once you get that approval from the state, they send you a card in the mail that you present to vendors when you're buying things like computers and say, we're buying this on behalf of a nonprofit and we don't have to pay state sales tax on it.
All right.
So I'll send some information about that, but that's a good question.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So that's the Form 1. Happy to talk more about that either at the end of the workshop tonight, or I will have my contact information, so feel free to reach out with questions. The second tax filing that you want to be aware of for your organization is the Form 990N e-postcard. This is the annual tax form for the IRS. And I'm talking about the Form 990N e-postcard. That's the version of this tax form that most organizations we work with are filling out. It's for organizations that have all their revenue, all their gross receipts for the year is $50,000 or less. For larger organizations, the version of the form will be the 990 or the 990-EZ. So I'm happy to send information about those versions of the form as well. So who must file this form every year? So all tax exempt organizations except for religious groups, churches, and other places of worship. So everybody has to fill this out except for those religious organizations, even if you don't yet have 501c3 status. You definitely need to fill it out if you have 501c3 status. But if you don't have that status yet, the IRS has said you should still fill this out and you should give the IRS a call to get the information to complete it. The exception is if your revenue, your gross receipts is less than $5,000 for the year. If you bring in more than $5,000 for the year, even if you're not a 501c3, the organization should complete this tax filing. It's due based on the organization's fiscal year. So if your organization is on a calendar year, January 1st to December 31st, it should fill this out, complete it, send it to the IRS by May 15th. So the deadline is the 15th day of the 5th month of your organization's fiscal year. And why you fill it out, you do this to maintain the organization's 501c3 status and report to the organization, to the IRS on the organization's finances. If you miss this filing, if you don't complete it for 3 years in a row, the organization's 501c3 status will be automatically revoked. So there's no human involved in that process. There's nobody to appeal to. It just happens automatically if the organization misses this filing for 3 years in a row. When that happens, the organization's name is added to the IRS revocation list, and you lose your 501c3 status. So you then you may be subject to income tax again. You're ineligible to get those tax deductible donations. You might not be able to apply for grants that only 501c3s can apply for. So make sure you're doing this filing every year so that, if something happens, you can still, have the continuity of the forms and not run into the revocation issue. If you do run into this issue and your organization gets its 501c3 status revoked, you can still reinstate that status, but you have to file the full 1023 form again and pay a new fee. So in some circumstances, you can get it reinstated back to the original date. So there's no break in your 501c3 status, but you're still going to be listed as having been revoked previously. So even if you get the status back, you'll still be on that list. And so you really want to avoid revocation by filing every year. You can check the organization's status online and see if it's filled out the 990s for recent years by going to the IRS website, the Select Check tool, and then different versions of the form. So we're talking here about the 990N, the first one in this chart, organizations with gross receipts that are normally $50,000 or less. So those organizations will probably choose to do the 990N because it's the simplest form. It requires the least amount of information, so it's going to take up the least amount of your time. If your organization has between 50,000 and 200,000 in gross dollars and gross receipts for the year, so everything you bring in before taking out expenses, all of your grants, donations, other income, before you subtract expenses, if that's between $50,000 and $200,000 for the year, and your total assets are less than $500,000, then you would file the 990EZ. If the organization has gross receipts over $200,000 or total assets of over $500,000, then you'll do the longest form, the 990. And for some of those longer forms, the EZ, the 990, I would recommend, you may want to have a tax preparer help with that. Take a look and just make sure that your accounting practices are, according to best practice, and just have someone take a look at that. And one thing I'll say, we're working on doing some more workshops that are aimed around financial accountability, financial structure, making sure you have the best practices in place for your organization. So stay tuned for that. Private foundations, the form that they'll complete is the 990PF. And I mentioned this already, but organizations with gross receipts of $50,000 or less, they'll do the 990. It's online only. So unlike those other versions of the form, the 990 and the 990EZ, which you can complete on paper, the 990N e-postcard is all online, and it's fairly short. I believe it's 8 questions total. So to complete it, you'll set up an account on the IRS website, and you'll need the organization's EIN, its legal name and mailing address, website if it has one, other names that it uses, the name and address of a principal officer, and then you'll need to confirm that the organization's annual gross receipts are $50,000 or less. If you've missed filing for previous years, you can't, as far as I know, you can't file those missing previous years on the IRS website. There are some outside service providers that can help you fill out previous year's forms, but they do charge a fee for that service. So in general, I really recommend organizations just make sure you're current for this year and set reminders for yourself for future years so that you don't run into that issue of revocation for the future. There's no late fee for filing late, but you do want to avoid having those 3 years in a row that you don't file. And then organizations that are not 501c3s yet, they may still need to fill out this form, the 990N, and you can call the IRS to establish an account to complete this form. Okay, one thing to be aware of, we've gotten some notices from our clients and other groups saying that they're getting these letters in the mail, these notices around tax season about filing the 990N. And sometimes they look like they're an official communication from the IRS, but they aren't necessarily. So this one looks like it's from 501c3 Center in Florida. And they seem to be businesses that can help with filing 990s or doing other filings. They're charging a fee to do this. So be aware that, even if it looks like an official document, make sure you know who it's coming from, because there's no fee to file the 990N. So if somebody is saying, you have to pay this and pay a fee to us to file it, that's not the IRS. That may be a company that's saying, we can help you do this, and it's a for-profit business. So it's not affiliated with the IRS. It's just, saying, we can help you fill this out. So feel free to send us a copy to take a look if you have questions about something you get, but just be aware you don't have to go through a third-party service provider to fill out this form. Okay, any questions about the IRS forms before we move on?
Which 990 does the churches fill out?
Great question. So they don't actually need to fill out any 990. Once they have 501c3 status, even though, like every other nonprofit that has 501c3 status, they have that recognition from the IRS, they don't need to fill out any annual form. The reason really is that religious organizations are considered automatically tax exempt. So they don't even need to apply for 501c3 status, but some choose to apply anyway, just to get that official recognition, to have the form. Maybe they need it to apply for grants and things. So churches, other places of worship don't need to fill out the 990 or any version of it. Great question. Any other questions? All right. So the third annual filing, the charitable solicitation registration. So this is separate from the previous two that we've covered. This is something that the Maryland Secretary of State requires of any organization that is soliciting charitable donations or applying for grants in Maryland. So anybody who's asking for charitable donations in Maryland should complete this annual registration. Again, the exception here, religious organizations are exempt, and those that seek donations only from their membership are exempt. They don't have to fill it out. But anybody else, if you are, sending an email, please donate to our crowdfunding campaign. If you are asking for donations at events or holding fundraising events, make sure you're filling out this annual charitable solicitation registration. The due date for this form is within 6 months of the end of your fiscal year. So if you're on a calendar year, it would be due in June. But again, we're currently under the state of emergency due to the pandemic. So that deadline is on hold for now, but your grantors may still want to see a copy of, did you do this registration for the year? So what it does, it notifies the state that your organization is asking for donations in Maryland, and that just helps verify that, or it helps the state know who's asking for donations in Maryland. and that donations are being made to genuine charitable organizations. You want to fill this out because failure to register could leave the organization and its individual directors liable for damages, including criminal penalties. So make sure you're filling this one out every year. You can search for the organization and check its status on the state website that's provided in the link there. And one note, if your organization is raising money in other states, so if you're directing your charitable fundraising in other states, like you're saying we're also raising money in Delaware or Pennsylvania or Virginia or DC, they may have their own fundraising or charitable solicitation registration requirements. So you can go to that multi-state filing website and get information on other states' requirements. And then there's also a unified registration statement that you can use for most other states that have requirements. They may have additional forms for you to fill out beyond the unified registration statement, but there's a lot of information on that multi-state filing website about who do I talk to in other states to know what we need to do. So how to register, this is the one that breaks down along the lines of, did you receive more or less than $25,000 in donations for the last fiscal year? So if you received more than $25,000 in donations in the last fiscal year, the organization will file a registration statement, and there's a fee for organizations that bring in that higher amount of revenue to file this form. If you brought in less than $25,000 in donations for the fiscal year, you'll file an exempt organization fundraising notice. And so this is, there's no fee to file this version of the form, but again, you want to make sure you're doing this annually, updating it with the state. Okay, so some other important reminders. You want to make sure you are, whenever you're holding a meeting, you're keeping notes, keeping meeting minutes, and you have copies of those meeting minutes with your other important documents like your corporate records, your policies, and it may be a good idea to keep multiple copies, maybe a hard copy somewhere with one of your directors, and then maybe a version in the cloud that you can also access. Make sure you're keeping a budget, so that will help you when you're doing all of these tax filings at the end of the year. Take a look at your budget and say, okay, this will help us figure out what we need to report on, and review it regularly so that you're saying, okay, this is reflecting where we are, we're staying within budget, or we need to step up our fundraising efforts. It's a good idea to do an audit or a financial review, at least annually, but more often can be helpful just to make sure you know where you stand financially. And then it's a good idea to regularly review resident agent information, bank signatories, to make sure that information is current, so that those are still people who should be on those accounts. Good idea to regularly review your organizational bylaws, your policies on record keeping, fundraising, and your business plan. Are we still on track with our plan? Some things that you may want to consult attorneys or tax advisors on are if the organization has employees or is hiring employees, if it has trademarks or trade names, if it has unrelated business income. So if it has income from a source that's not related to its charitable activity. So if, for example, the organization runs a business just to get that revenue to support the charitable work, that may be considered unrelated business income that is subject to taxes. So talk to a tax attorney, you can talk to Community Law Center, you could talk to a tax advisor about that. Lobbying activities or activities in other states, all of those things, it's a good idea to just review them with an attorney or accountant. And then as Eric asked about, you can apply for exemption from state sales and use tax. So this is if the organization is buying anything, computers, equipment, supplies, food for meetings, supplies for meetings, you can apply for this exemption from the comptroller. And once it's granted, they send you a card in the mail that you present when you buy things on behalf of the organization, and then you don't have to pay sales and use tax on those items. Other things to keep in mind, make sure you're providing receipts for donations of over $250 to the donor so that they can claim that tax deduction. If you are sending out fundraising materials or asking for donations in writing, make sure you include this disclosure, the Maryland Charitable Solicitations Act disclosure, on your materials, saying that people can get a copy of your financial statement by contacting the organization, and that you're completing the charitable solicitation registration. If you sell anything, you may have to collect sales and use tax. So you can find information on that through the marylandtaxes.com website, and you can file that combined registration application through their website. And then if you have unrelated business income, so something unrelated to the charitable work that the organization does, other than supporting the charitable work, you may need to pay taxes on that and file with Maryland as well as with the IRS. So brief legal advice, if you have questions about any of the tax issues that we've covered tonight, or other legal issues, you can request a free brief legal advice appointment through Community Law Center to talk with an attorney for 45 minutes or so. And that you can do that, sign up for that through our website to request brief legal advice. If you want to apply for legal assistance to talk with an attorney more in depth and have them review documents or provide more specific targeted legal advice, you can apply for assistance on some of the issues here, the tax issues or other things that you may have questions about. We have some upcoming workshops. So starting a nonprofit, we cover forming a board, creating bylaws, incorporation, 501c3 status, staying in compliance. We do that workshop on starting and maintaining a nonprofit about once a month. So the next one is coming up next, is that next week, April 6th. And then in early May, you can sign up through our website. We're doing a workshop in partnership with the Pro Bono Resource Center of Maryland. Some employment law attorneys will be providing training on issues related to COVID for employers. So especially nonprofit employers on things like, what do you need to know about testing, vaccines, and vaccine requirements, potential exposure and how to handle that in the workplace, safety rules, and that's on April 30th. And then we can do more general trainings for organizations, boards, communities on various legal issues. So feel free to reach out to us about that. And here is our contact information. You'll also be getting a follow-up email with the slides and the forms that I mentioned and some other information. And I see there's, let me pull up the chat. I see there's some questions there. How do you get on the reminder list for filing? So I think that's for the question about the state reminder list. There is a link for that I'll make sure that you have access to get that, that update from the state. And then can you speak about home-based nonprofits, tax considerations? Can you say a little bit more about home-based nonprofits, Christina?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute. Yes, my nonprofit is home-based. So I was wondering, what should I keep in mind when submitting my taxes? Like, are there any tax credits for my nonprofit being home-based? Meaning I run it from my house?
I see. So tax credits for the nonprofit or for you as an individual tax
Both,
filer?
please.
Sorry?
Both?
Oh, both.
For me and for the organization.
So I can't speak for your individual taxes, but that is a good question. So I would say you may want to talk to your tax preparer or reach out to Maryland Cash about that to see if they have any information on that. I'm not aware of any tax credits for, for nonprofits that you would be able to take advantage of, for home-based nonprofits. If you are, is the organization a 501c3?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so you are going to be tax exempt then for the charitable income that the organization brings in. So so you already don't have to pay charitable income tax. But I would ask about for your personal taxes, and I'll say I know Marilyn Cash and Delegate Brooke Learman are planning a tax event coming up sometime soon. So when we hear about that, we'll definitely be advertising it. So keep an eye out about that. I think there will be probably lots of information on tax filings, and that may be an opportunity to ask that question as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. As I said, we will be sending out the follow-up slides, the email, the slides to everyone. And I'm happy to stick around. We're right at 7, so I want to let you go and have the rest of your evening. It looks like it might be clearing up outside, but I'm also happy to stick around if anybody has any questions that they want to ask right now. And thank you all for coming tonight and for your great questions. It's like last year, a little bit of a chaotic time with tax filings and everything else, but definitely happy to answer questions. So thank you, and yeah, feel free to ask your questions.
Tana, what the 990 filing again? When is that? When is that deadline again? Because I know on my letter it says when we it's like April something. So when do we have to do that again, or when? What are the dates again?
So for the 990, that one's based on your fiscal year. It's due the 15th day of the 5th month of your fiscal year. So what fiscal year are you on? Is it January to December?
I have it on my phone. Let me put it up.
Okay. Yeah, if you're on a calendar year, January 1st to December 31st, it'll be due May 15th. Great, thank you. Thanks for coming.
If you have a, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're right, man. You're fine.
If you have a 501c, you already have your tax exempt card, and it says it doesn't need, it's good through the expiration date of 2022, you still have to file every year to say you are still in existence with the non-charitable?
So I would want to know what the card is. It sounds like that might be the sales tax exemption card. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a couple different things that you need to file every year. The sales tax exemption card, it's just for what it says on the card. You have until, I guess it's 5 years, and then you have to renew, that you don't have to pay sales tax.
Right.
But all the other filings you still have to do. So you still have to file with the state, you still have to file with the IRS to keep your status. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'm just making sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's lots of things to keep in mind, lots of moving parts. So just doing one, you still want to make sure you do all the other filings too.
Okay, because right now I'm kind of concerned when you're saying that even though we may not be at $25,000, we still should file a personal tax. If you bought computers or any art supplies, anything like that, you need to file because that's considered a personal property.
So yeah, so there's a couple different things there. You definitely need to file the Form 1 annual report. If you're a nonprofit, you have to file that one to keep your nonprofit status.
Right.
So regardless of what you bring in, what you spend, file that annual report Form 1.
Okay.
The $25,000 comes in with the charitable solicitation registration. So that's a separate filing from the annual report, and that's
right.
The Secretary of State of Maryland, and they just want to know who's raising money, who's asking for donations in Maryland. And so you'll have to file with them if you're asking for any donations in Maryland. It's just that the version of the form is different if you raised more or less than $25,000.
Okay.
But so when you get the the slides and the materials, I try to like list out, okay, here's the things you want to be aware of and when they're due. So you'll see the Form 1 is one thing you file. The charitable solicitation registration is a separate one. So, and then there'll be links to where you file those.
Okay.
Shane, it says Form 1120, April 15th, 2021.
Form 1120. Is this the form that says you've been recognized as 501c3?
I believe, this came from the IRS with my EIN number. Yeah.
With the EIN. Okay. I would say I may want to take a look at that. So maybe if you email me a copy, I can take a look and just see,
Okay.
what it says. But yeah, just to see, and I can also take a look at the bylaws. So I'll make sure to follow up with you tomorrow about that.
All right. Thank you, Shane. Have a good evening.
Absolutely. Thank you. You too. All right. Anybody else have any other questions that I can answer? Oh, Janice, I think you're muted.
I don't, but I really miss that we don't meet in person. That was really nice. We could all sit and you could see the forms together, but this is a new way of doing things and just trying to get it together. But okay, I'm gonna double check on that form. I think I've sent everything in that I was supposed to send in for the year, but I will go back and check that other form.
Great. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I really miss, I mean, it's for me, I appreciated that I could see some people during this workshop. Often my workshops, everyone has their camera turned off now. And so I'm like, is anybody out there? I'm just, looking at my own face for the whole workshop. So, and, I think it's easier for people to ask questions when we're in person and, you don't have to go off mute and everything. I do think, there's probably people that have been able to come to some of these workshops that wouldn't have been able to come otherwise, with
That too.
the commute, accessibility, picking up kids and jobs and all of that. So, we're thinking about once we can all be together in person, keeping doing some online workshops still, but I'm definitely looking forward to being back in person again. For sure.
Well,
Right.
I have a question.
Sure.
Now, we don't have money in our 501c3. We don't own any property in our 501c3. So truthfully, I don't